In recent weeks, renewed public attention has focused on historical associations between former US President Donald Trump and financier Jeffrey Epstein. The discussion has intensified after previously circulated media clips, interviews, and archival material resurfaced online, prompting commentators and analysts to re-examine past reporting and documented interactions. The controversy gained momentum following a congressional hearing in which lawmakers questioned Department of Justice officials about redactions contained within investigative records related to Epstein. During the exchange, concerns were raised about why certain communications remain withheld, particularly material referencing contacts between Epstein, his associates, and individuals connected to Trump or his legal representatives. Critics argue that the lack of transparency fuels speculation and undermines public confidence, while supporters of the redactions maintain that legal protections, such as attorney-client privilege or internal deliberation, safeguards may justify withholding sensitive information. The disagreement reflects a broader national debate about how much of the Epstein case should be made fully public, especially given the high-profile figures whose names have surfaced over the years. At the center of the discussion is not a single new allegation, but rather the interpretation of historical records, social connections, and media appearances that date back decades. Analysts note that Epstein moved within elite social circles that included business leaders, celebrities, and politicians across multiple administrations, making retrospective scrutiny both complex and politically charged. As archived footage, interviews, and reporting are revisited, observers are attempting to piece together timelines, relationships, and context that may clarify how these individuals interacted in the past, and whether any of those associations raise unresolved ethical or legal questions today. The issue moved back into the spotlight during a congressional hearing involving Attorney General Pam Bondi, where Representative Dan Goldman questioned why significant portions of Epstein-related materials remain redacted. Lawmakers expressed concern that nearly half of certain reviewed records were withheld despite legislative efforts aimed at increasing transparency. At the center of the exchange were communications involving Jeffrey Epstein and associate Ghislaine Maxwell, including references to interactions with individuals connected to Donald Trump. Critics argued that the legal justification for these redactions, reportedly tied to privilege protections, has not been sufficiently explained to Congress or the public. Officials from the U.S. Department of Justice maintain that document review is complex, involving millions of pages gathered across multiple investigations and jurisdictions. They caution that releasing material without proper legal vetting could compromise privacy rights or ongoing legal standards. Still, some legislators say the balance between confidentiality and accountability must be reassessed given the scale of public interest in the Epstein case. The hearing underscored how unresolved questions continue to generate political friction, particularly when historical relationships intersect with modern transparency demands. Rather than producing definitive conclusions, the session highlighted how interpretation of past associations has become a matter of legal debate, media analysis, and partisan disagreement, ensuring that scrutiny surrounding Epstein's network remains an active issue years after his death. Much of the renewed attention stems from efforts to reconstruct Epstein's social environment during the late 1980s and 1990s, when he cultivated relationships with influential figures in business, entertainment, and politics. During that era, elite gatherings often blurred the lines between professional networking and socializing, making retrospective analysis particularly challenging. One frequently mentioned location is Mar-a-Lago, the private club and residence long associated with Trump. Reports and interviews from the time describe Epstein attending events there as a guest, though accounts differ on how regularly he visited and under what circumstances. Supporters of the former president have pointed to later distancing between the two men as evidence that their association ended well before Epstein's legal troubles became widely known. Critics, however, argue that earlier interactions deserve closer scrutiny to better understand the nature of their relationship during the years when Epstein was building his network. Experts in political history caution against drawing conclusions from social proximity alone, noting that Epstein's connections extended across ideological and professional lines. Financial elites, celebrities, academics, and public officials all appeared within his orbit at various times, complicating attempts to characterize any single relationship. As journalists revisit archive coverage, photographs, and guest lists, the broader question has become less about isolated encounters and more about how Epstein was able to integrate himself so deeply into prominent social circles without facing earlier consequences. Digital platforms have played a major role in reviving discussion, particularly as older footage and reporting segments are reshared to new audiences. One outlet frequently cited in online conversations is the Midas Touch Network, which has compiled archival clips and commentary examining past public appearances and statements. Media analysts note that the modern information environment allows decades-old material to circulate rapidly, often detached from its original context. Videos once confined to television archives can now be replayed millions of times, encouraging renewed interpretation and debate. This phenomenon reflects a broader shift in how historical accountability is shaped in the digital age. Rather than relying solely on newly uncovered evidence, public discourse is increasingly driven by reinterpretation of material that has existed for years but is now easier to access and distribute. Scholars describe this as a form of retrospective amplification, where contemporary political tensions influence how audiences perceive historical events. The same footage may be viewed very differently depending on today's social climate, leading to sharply divided conclusions about its meaning or significance. As a result, discussions surrounding Epstein's associations are being shaped not only by legal developments, but also by evolving media ecosystems that continuously recycle and reassess the past. Additional attention has come from commentary by author and journalist Michael Wolff, who has spoken publicly about interactions and materials he claims to have seen during his reporting career. His recollections shared in interviews have been discussed widely but remain part of a broader set of personal accounts rather than adjudicated findings. Media experts emphasize that such statements, while newsworthy, represent anecdotal testimony unless supported by documentary evidence. Nonetheless, they contribute to the mosaic of narratives that continue to surround Epstein's life and connections. Biographers often rely on interviews, private recollections, and second-hand observations when reconstructing social histories of powerful figures. These sources can provide valuable context, but may also introduce disputes over accuracy, memory, and interpretation. The debate highlights a recurring challenge in high-profile investigations, distinguishing between verifiable documentation and claims that remain contested. Without full public access to underlying records, competing narratives are likely to persist. For observers, the continued circulation of these accounts reinforces the perception that key aspects of Epstein's world remain insufficiently explained even after years of investigative reporting and legal proceedings. Some of the most discussed recollections involve stories from entertainers who describe visiting elite gatherings during the early 1990s. Among them is Uncle Luke, a member of the hip-hop group 2 Live Crew, who recounted attending a party connected to Trump's social circle. He has said in interviews that he left the event early after feeling uncomfortable with the atmosphere, though he did not allege witnessing criminal conduct. His account also referenced the presence of boxing champion Mike Tyson and actor Eddie Murphy, illustrating how celebrity culture frequently intersected with high society gatherings of that period. Cultural historians point out that the 1990s saw a convergence of entertainment, sports, and real estate wealth, with lavish parties serving as networking hubs for multiple industries. Such environments, while glamorous, often lacked the scrutiny that would later accompany them in the post-social media era. These recollections therefore provide snapshots of a broader cultural moment, one defined by opulence and informality, rather than definitive evidence about the relationships now being debated. Another frequently cited episode involves tennis star Monica Seles, who at age 17 temporarily withdrew from competition at Wimbledon and was reported at the time to have stayed at Trump's Florida property. Contemporary news coverage portrayed the visit largely as a retreat from media pressure, with family members accompanying her. Still, the story has resurfaced in modern discussions as commentators reassess past interactions through today's lens. Sports analysts caution that elite athletes, particularly young prodigies, often rely on wealthy patrons or sponsors for logistical support, making such arrangements not uncommon in professional tennis during that era. The renewed focus on this episode reflects how historical reporting can acquire new significance when revisited alongside unrelated controversies. What once appeared to be a routine celebrity-host interaction is now scrutinized as part of a larger narrative about social proximity and influence. This re-examination underscores how evolving cultural standards can reshape interpretations of events long after they occurred. In addition to third-party recollections, archived interviews featuring Trump himself have been widely circulated online. Commentators analyzing these appearances argue that remarks once treated as casual or humorous are now being judged against stricter contemporary expectations. Communication scholars note that public figures from previous decades often spoke in ways that would draw sharper criticism today, reflecting shifting norms about gender, power, and professionalism. As these clips reappear, audiences reinterpret them through modern ethical frameworks. This process does not necessarily establish wrongdoing, analysts say, but it does influence public perception by placing historical statements in a new cultural environment, one more attuned to questions of accountability and conduct. The broader phenomenon illustrates how reputations can be reshaped not only by new revelations, but also by changing societal values that alter how past behavior is evaluated. Ultimately, the renewed scrutiny surrounding Epstein's associations highlights the difficulty of reconciling historical relationships with present-day demands for transparency. Legal processes move slowly, while public discourse, driven by digital media, evolves at remarkable speed. Supporters of further disclosure argue that releasing additional records would help resolve speculation and restore confidence in institutional oversight. Others warn that selective interpretation of decades-old material risks politicizing complex historical realities. What remains clear is that Epstein's network continues to cast a long shadow over public life, raising enduring questions about how influence operates within elite circles and how accountability should be pursued when events span generations. As investigations, document reviews, and journalistic work continue, the conversation is likely to persist, less as a single news story and more as an ongoing examination of power, memory, and the public's right to understand the past.